In 2010, two economists at Harvard published a paper that became one of the most cited pieces of economic research in modern history. Governments across Europe and North America used it to justify a decade of austerity, spending cuts, wage freezes, public service reductions that affected hundreds of millions of people. The paper's core finding was specific and powerful. Countries with debt above 90% of GDP experienced dramatically lower economic growth. In 2013, a graduate student checked the spreadsheet. There was a coding error. When corrected, the 90% threshold, the number that had shaped a decade of policy, did not exist in the data. In 2010, two economists published a paper called Growth in a Time of Debt. It argued, using data from 44 countries over several decades, that when a country's public debt exceeds 90% of its GDP, economic growth drops dramatically, falling to an average of negative 0.1% per year, compared to positive growth rates at lower debt levels. The 90% figure was specific, memorable, and actionable. It gave policymakers a clear threshold. Cross this line, and the data says your economy suffers. The paper was cited in congressional testimony in the United States. It was referenced by European Commission officials justifying austerity programs in Greece, Portugal, Spain, and Ireland. It was used by finance ministers across the developed world to argue that spending cuts were not a political choice, but a mathematical necessity. The research did not cause austerity. The political conditions for austerity existed before the paper. But the paper gave those conditions an intellectual foundation that was enormously difficult to argue against, because arguing against the policy now meant arguing against the data. In 2013, a graduate student at the University of Massachusetts named Thomas Herndon was completing a class assignment that required him to replicate the results of a famous economics paper. He chose the Harvard paper. He emailed the authors requesting the original spreadsheet. They sent it. He loaded it into his own software, ran the analysis, and got a different result. After checking and rechecking his own work, he found the source of the discrepancy, a coding error in the original spreadsheet that had excluded several countries from the calculation. When those countries were included and the error corrected, the dramatic 90% threshold effect largely disappeared from the data. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how that error traveled from a spreadsheet into global policy, and what that journey reveals about how economic arguments actually work and who they actually serve. To understand how a spreadsheet error became the intellectual foundation for a decade of economic policy, you need to understand how economic research moves from an academic paper into government decisions, because the process is less rigorous and more political than most people assume. When a research paper is published in a top economics journal, it goes through peer review, a process where other economists evaluate the methodology and findings before publication. Peer review is valuable. It catches many errors and improves many papers. But peer review has a specific limitation that is rarely discussed publicly. Reviewers typically evaluate the methodology and the logic of the analysis, not the underlying data and code. They check whether the statistical approach is appropriate, whether the conclusions follow from the findings, whether the literature review is adequate. They do not, in most cases, run the original analysis themselves on the original data. That kind of replication, actually checking whether the numbers in the paper are what the authors say they are, is a separate and much rarer process. The Harvard paper's peer review did not catch the spreadsheet error because the peer reviewers were not given the spreadsheet. They evaluated the paper. The paper reported results that came from the spreadsheet. The error was invisible in the paper. It only became visible when someone examined the original data file itself, which is what the graduate student did 3 years later. Now here is how the research reached policy. Academic papers in economics rarely travel directly from journals to government decisions. They travel through intermediaries, think tanks, policy advisors, research summaries, and media coverage, each of which simplifies and amplifies the finding. The 90% threshold was a perfect policy travel finding. It was specific, it was numerical, and it translated cleanly into a headline. Countries with debt above 90% of GDP grow more slowly is a sentence that a finance minister can use in a press conference, that a journalist can put in a headline, that a politician can cite without explaining methodology. The specificity of the number made it useful. The complexity of the methodology, the spreadsheet that produced it, was invisible to everyone repeating it. This is not unique to this paper. It is the standard pathway by which academic economic research becomes policy narrative. The finding simplifies. The methodology disappears. The number travels without its caveats. And by the time a graduate student finds an error in the original spreadsheet, the policy that grew from the finding has been implemented, the spending has been cut, and the populations who bore those cuts cannot be made whole by a correction published in an academic journal. The correction receives a fraction of the attention the original finding generated. The policy direction continues. And here is what that actually cost, in specific, measurable terms. Here is what the research error cost, not in abstract economic terms, but in the specific changes to the lives of ordinary people in the countries where the 90% threshold was cited most prominently as justification for policy. In the United Kingdom, the government that came to power in 2010 implemented what became known as one of the most extensive austerity programs in the country's modern history. Public spending was reduced across health, housing, local government, and social support programs. The official justification referenced the need to avoid the debt levels that research had shown to be economically damaging. Independent economic analyses conducted after the austerity period found that the cuts reduced economic output below what it would have been under alternative spending scenarios, meaning the policy justified by a finding about debt-reducing growth may itself have contributed to slower growth than the alternative. The finding was used to justify the cure. Evidence suggested the cure produced some of the symptoms it was meant to prevent. In Greece, the austerity conditions attached to international bailout agreements, conditions shaped by the same intellectual environment the Harvard paper had contributed to, produced documented, measurable deterioration in public health outcomes, employment levels, and living standards across a significant portion of the population. Suicide rates increased. Access to healthcare declined. Youth unemployment reached levels that researchers described as economically scarring, meaning the long-term career and income trajectories of an entire generation were durably affected by the conditions of their early working years. Now here is the personal mirror for anyone watching from a country that implemented austerity programs during this period. Think about what public services you used between 2010 and 2020. A public hospital, a public library, a road, a social program. Whatever you relied on, the funding for that service was operating in an environment shaped by the argument that high debt required cuts. The quality or availability of that service during that decade was downstream of a policy direction that was downstream of a research finding that was downstream of a spreadsheet with a formula error. The error was small. The chain of consequences was long. And the distance between the spreadsheet cell and the service you used was filled by the intermediary process we just covered. The think tanks, the policy advisors, the press conferences, the headlines. Each step removing the caveats further from the conclusion. This is not an argument about whether austerity was right or wrong as a policy direction. Economists continue to debate that question with genuine disagreement. It is an argument about something more fundamental. That economic research shapes lived experience through a process that is far less rigorous and far more politically contingent than the authority with which it is cited suggests. When a finance minister says the data shows this is necessary, the data is a spreadsheet someone made, interpreted by economists with their own assumptions and limitations, summarized by think tanks with their own institutional orientations, translated by journalists working on deadline, and cited by politicians who had policy preferences before the research arrived. Understanding that chain, every link of it, is the foundation for evaluating every economic argument you will encounter for the rest of your life. If tracing that chain from spreadsheet cell to public service just changed how you hear economic policy arguments, stay with me. Because the spreadsheet error is the most concrete version of a broader pattern. The pattern of how research becomes policy and who controls which research travels. And here is what makes that pattern more relevant to your financial life than it might seem. The same pipeline that moved this error into policy is the same pipeline that shapes the economic environment your salary, your savings, and your investments operate inside. That is what comes next. Here is the structural reality of how economic research reaches the decisions that shape your financial life, and why the Harvard spreadsheet story is not an anomaly, but an illustration of how the system normally works. Economic research that becomes policy does not do so randomly. It travels through a specific institutional infrastructure. Elite universities generate the research, major think tanks translate it into policy language, and governments hire from the same professional networks that produced both. This infrastructure has its own institutional biases, not in the sense of intentional deception, but in the sense that the research questions that get funded, the findings that get amplified, and the policies that get recommended all reflect the values and interests of the institutions involved. Research that supports the case for deficit reduction travels efficiently through this pipeline. Research that supports the case for investment spending faces more institutional friction at the translation stages, not because it is less rigorous, but because it aligns less cleanly with the institutional priorities of the most influential nodes in the network. This is not a conspiracy. It is the normal operation of any institutional system in which certain findings are more useful to certain actors than others. The think tanks that cited the Harvard paper most extensively were institutionally oriented toward fiscal conservatism. The policymakers who cited those think tanks had political incentives to frame spending cuts as technical necessity rather than political choice. The research gave them the language to do that. The research happened to contain an error, but the finding would have traveled the same path if it had been correct, because its usefulness to the pipeline preceded its adoption by the pipeline. Drop in the comments whether you remember a specific public service in your country that was reduced or eliminated during the austerity years, and whether you were told at the time that the cuts were economically necessary. I want to map the distance between the spreadsheet and what people actually experienced, because that distance is where the system operates invisibly. Now here is the part that actually changes how you engage with economic arguments going forward. The authority of economic research and public debate is not proportional to the rigor of the underlying research. It is proportional to the institutional power of the entities promoting it. A well-funded think tank citing a flawed paper generates more policy influence than a graduate student publishing a careful correction. The replication study that catches the error is less legible to policy audiences than the original finding. The correction requires more background knowledge to evaluate than the original claim. And corrections are not covered by the same media outlets that covered the original finding with the same prominence or urgency. The system is not designed to self-correct efficiently. It is designed to move findings into policy efficiently, and those are not the same design goal. Here is what you can do with this story every time you encounter an economic argument used to justify a policy that affects your financial life. The first question is, who funded the research, and who is amplifying it? This is not a conspiracy question. It is an institutional literacy question. Research funded by organizations with strong policy preferences tends to produce findings that support those preferences. Research amplified by think tanks with institutional orientations tends to support those orientations. This does not mean the research is wrong. It means the finding did not travel to you neutrally. It arrived through a pipeline with its own direction. Knowing the direction of the pipeline is the starting point for evaluating the finding. The second question is, has this been replicated? The Harvard paper's finding was treated as settled for 3 years before anyone checked the spreadsheet. In any area where a single paper is cited as definitive evidence for a major policy direction, the question of independent replication is not a technicality. It is the most important methodological question available. If the finding has only one source, the source is more fragile than the confidence with which it is cited suggests. The third question is, who bears the cost if the finding is wrong? In the austerity case, the people who bore the cost of the error, reduced public services, lost jobs, scarred career trajectories, were not the economists who published the paper, the think tanks that promoted it, or the finance ministers who cited it. The cost of an economic policy error is rarely borne by the people who made the policy. Understanding that asymmetry changes how you evaluate the confidence with which policy claims are made, because the people making the claims have less to lose from being wrong than the people living with the consequences. Ask those 3 questions about every economic argument that affects your financial life. The framework does not tell you the right answer. It tells you what the argument is not telling you. One spreadsheet error became the intellectual foundation for a decade of policy that reduced public services for hundreds of millions of people. The error was eventually found. The correction was barely heard. The consequences cannot be undone. This is not a story about academic fraud. It is a story about how economic arguments travel, who controls the pipeline, and who bears the cost when the pipeline produces something wrong. Those three questions, funding, replication, and cost asymmetry, are the tools. Use them every time. Share this with one person who has ever heard an economic argument used to justify a policy and accepted it because the data said so. And if you want to keep understanding how the systems that shape your financial life actually work, subscribe to Hidden Truth Files. Hidden no more.